Okay, cool. Welcome back. So for the remainder, what I'd like to do, well, again, two parts here. The first bit, I'm going to talk about some background notions. So what we're going to do is kind of separate out some stuff we're not going to talk about. That'll be our first bit. And then I'm going to give you a few more definitions that'll be kind of relevant. Again, formally, as you go through, you'll always be able to spot the big blue boxes. That'll always have the definitions that I might ask you about. The stuff that really is going to matter for us, right? It's always going to be in one of those blue boxes. That's going to be the bulk of our time. And then we're going to wrap up. Hopefully we make the timing right, where we'll start in on learning our first formal language of truth functional logic. Really, really kind of early steps. So, first thing to do, some background notions, is not only are not all arguments created equal in terms of goodness and badness, but there's different kinds of arguments, right? So actually, one type of argument is a deductive argument. This is actually what we've been looking at so far. Hey, come on in. Come around, it's okay. No, don't worry. So a deductive argument, right, is this sort of structure. The premises are meant to kind of guarantee the conclusion. Come on, it's okay. Contrast the deductive structure with this middle one, an inductive argument. You've undoubtedly come across this sort of stuff before. Have you seen this terminology before as well? Notion of an inductive argument? Right. So basically an inductive argument is where you generalize from particular cases, or you build from past cases to make predictions about the future.
Like the swamps.
That's another example, right? Depending on how you structure it. Yes, basically, right, is you take particular instances, and then you either make, again, a prediction about the future or a generalized claim. Dropped this yesterday, the day before, the day before, the day before. If I drop it now, it's going to fall to the ground. Third kind of argument type. Have people come across this notion of abduction before? It's often, well, I'll give you the example, right? So premise one, Bill and Ted had a falling out last week and aren't speaking to each other. Premise two, this morning, I was walking by the garage and I saw them jamming out. So conclusion, Bill and Ted had made up at some point in between. They're back to being bros again. So this is kind of like the deductive argument, but note that what we're really doing here is the conclusion is meant to explain how it is that all the premises fit together. So another form, another way abductive arguments are often labeled is an inference to the best explanation. You have a complex series of data points, your premises, and your conclusion is meant to be whatever best explains how they all fit together. So, my favorite joke about this bit, right? Sherlock Holmes always says that, it's just simple deduction, Watson. That's a bunch of bullshit. Holmes is hardly ever doing deduction. He's almost always doing abduction. He's almost always doing a sort of inference to best explanation. Yeah.
But an abductive argument doesn't have to be true. It's just a guess.
It's an attempt, right? It's a best explanation, and it might be that there's more data points that actually show this is a bad explanation after all. So yeah, it doesn't have to be right. Yes?
So just for myself, an abductive argument is inferencing the best possible conclusion from the given premises.
So it's sort of the conclusion is the best explanation for why all the premises turn out to be true.
All right.
And exactly as we just heard, it might be that there's some extra information we don't know that shows that best explanation actually isn't one after all. Because it's only for an agent at a time. They're doing the best they can. This highlights something too. If we're thinking about the strength or the way that these arguments work. So taking our inductive argument here, valid, invalid. Is our middle argument valid or invalid?
It's invalid.
It's invalid, right? And in fact, no matter how much evidence we plug in here, if it's only ever past facts, it's not going to guarantee that this is true. It's possible for all these 98 premises in there to be true, and our conclusion to be false. I could let it go and the damn thing could hover, or go up. Admittedly, things would be weird, right? But that's a possibility. How about this one? Valid, invalid? It's valid, right? There's no way for 1 and 2 to be true and 3 to be false. Bilbo lives in Bag End. Bilbo is a hobbit. So then it must be the case that a hobbit lives in Bag End, because Bilbo is a hobbit and he's the one who lives there. And how about our third one? Valid, invalid? What do we think?
It's invalid because it's possible for the conclusion to be false and all the premises to be true.
Yeah, right? They might be hate jamming. They might still not be bros anymore, but they just need to get their anger out in music, right? There's a possible situation where the premises are true and the conclusion's false, right? So this highlights something about these kinds of argumentative types. Deductive ones can be valid or invalid, depending on how things go. Inductive arguments, 99.99999% of the time, are invalid. And the same thing with abductive ones. This isn't to say that they're bad. They're just different. They do different things. Deductive arguments give us something about a necessary, unbreakable link between premises and conclusions, at least the valid ones. But good inductive and abductive arguments don't necessarily express an unbreakable connection between the truth of the premises and the truth of the conclusion. They might motivate belief, but they don't give us a guarantee. As a cheap and cheery joke, here's a good inductive argument whose conclusion turns out to be horribly, horribly wrong. It's a little bit North American centric, right? But we've got some turkeys, and hey, the farmer's fed us every single day. He's treated us so terribly wonderfully, right? We're super happy. And one of the turkeys is like, oh, I'm a little worried today. It feels a little different. And no, it's going to be fine. It's just like every day before. And unfortunately, happy Thanksgiving. So one upshot of this is, of course, meat is murder, go vegan, right? But the other option, the other thing to note is that good inductive arguments don't necessarily guarantee their conclusion. Right? It's just a different type of thing. This isn't to say that these types of arguments are worthless or bad or less valuable, just they do different kinds of work. The level of epistemic security in a valid deductive argument is something that is unmatched. This is, again, another reason why we should be interested in validity. It's a guarantee of the relationship between the truth of premises and the truth of conclusion. So for our purposes, we're only going to focus on deductive arguments. You'll talk about inductive and abductive arguments in other courses. They'll come up in other places, especially in things like philosophy of science, stuff like that. That's not really for our concern. Here, we're just looking at the deductive ones. But it's helpful to get a grip on these different types. Okay. Yes?
Was it you said that deductiveness is some sort of necessity?
Yeah, good. So the idea is that this valid deductive argument expresses a necessary and unbreakable connection. And the abductive ones don't. And again, this idea, what I have here in these two little bullet points, that's just another way of saying they're valid. It's not possible to make the premises true and the conclusion false. Just kind of re-encoding or restating that same core idea. Okay. So that's to put aside two other types of arguments. We're just going to focus on deductive ones. Now there's a couple more things I want to again, we're sorting wheat from chaff here. right? And we have to talk about types of sentences. So there's lots of different types of sentences, but one way we can demarcate them is to talk about assertoric and non-assertoric sentences. Put really bluntly, assertoric sentences assert things. They say things are or are not a certain kind of way. Non-assertoric sentences don't. And it's easy to kind of get a grip on this by thinking about examples, right? So you might have a question, like, can you get this round? Or an imperative, buy the next round. I'm not picking on you, just or an exclamation, like, oh my God. Whoa, there. Or an assertion, we had far too many drinks last night. Now, what's noticeable about these different types of sentences is that only the last one can be true or false. Right? The assertion says something about the world that might be the case or it might not be the case, depending on what exactly you did last night. These other ones, it doesn't really make sense to say that they're true or that they're false. Can you get the next round? Well, you could say yes or no, but that's not the same as truth or falsity. Yes?
So that could be excuse for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, don't feel like you have to ask. It's okay, just go. The same thing with the imperative, right? The imperative might be obeyed or disobeyed, but that's not the same as it being true or false. Right? So that's something to note about types of sentences. Right? Now, because we're interested in this notion of validity, and validity relates back to the possible truth or falsity of the premises and the conclusions, we're only going to be interested in assertoric sentences. Yes?
So, in the true functional language is useful, is useless for the non-assertive sentences.
It's not going to help us really make sense of those. Right? But that kind of makes sense, right? Because if you think about an argument as giving you something like reasons, motivations to buy into the last thing, these aren't giving you reasons, not in the same sense of giving reasons, right? This might be a threat, right? And that might give you some practical motivation, but it's not giving you epistemic reasons. Right? It's not motivating it in the kind of sense we're after. Yeah, we're only going to be interested in those. Again, this is just sort of being clear about different things. Now, one block of things that is important and is actually pretty substantive is we have to make some assumptions about the nature of truth and falsity. We're going to make 3 assumptions. Our first is that there's only 2 truth values. There's true and there's false. There's no kind of intermediate stuff. Right? So there's on and off, 1, 0, true, false. No ambiguities. This is a simplifying assumption to get us going. As I've noted here, other logics allow for variation in between, but this is the place to start. The second assumption we're going to make is that there are no truth value gaps. So what this means is that every assertion, every assertoric sentence is either going to be true or false. So there's only on or off, and no gaps means every sentence that could be true or false has one of the 2. Right? It's either on or it's off. It's either 1 or 0. It's either true or it's false. And similarly, our third assumption is that there are no gluts. And that means that no sentence is both. Right? So together, no gaps, no gluts tells us every assertoric sentence is either true or false, and no assertoric sentence is both true and false. So it divides the world of assertoric sentences into all the ones that are true and all the ones that are false, and they're exclusive. These are all simplifying assumptions. They're things that we're going to work with because, frankly, it's going to be hard enough with just these restrictions. We'll talk a little bit in week 7 about how we might loosen these. For example, just to kind of give you a grip on cases where we might want to loosen it, right? if we're talking about truth in fiction, what's true according to a given story, it seems like there should be lots of gaps. Does Watson have an even or an odd number of hairs on his head? The story doesn't say. Just seems like it's not really something that's true or false in the story. It's a gap. And maybe fiction is the kind of thing where we could have gluts. That is, we could have sentences that are both true and false according to the story. Again, something to kind of come back to. But for our purposes, two truth values, true and false. They're exhaustive. Every sentence is either true or false, and they're exclusive. No sentence is both true and false. Cool? Cool. Now, I want to introduce a few more definitions, a few more conceptual notions. These are very broad, and we're going to introduce, as we develop along, formalized ways of tracking them. But it's helpful just to get a grip on these fundamental concepts first. So, the first pair we've actually already kind of seen, and it's this idea that some sentences look like it's impossible to make them true together. So if we have Amanda's taller than Bart, and Bart's taller than Amanda, as long as we don't equivocate, that is, we use Amanda and the names Amanda and Bart to pick out the same people in both sentences, then 1 and 2 can't be true together. If 1 is true, 2 is false. If 2 is true, 1 is false. So, to put it in terms, and I think we mentioned this earlier, right? We can say some sentences are jointly consistent if and only if it's possible to make them all true together. And some sentences are jointly inconsistent if and only if it's impossible for them to all be true together. So in this case, 1 and 2 are jointly inconsistent. There's no way to make them all true together. So little alarm bells should be going off, right? Remember the Mars Moons example, that argument earlier. The reason it was valid was because the premises were jointly inconsistent. And in fact, more generally, if you ever have an argument whose premises are jointly inconsistent, you know the argument is valid. You don't have to do any more work. Yes?
Does the same go for jointly consistent?
Cool. Good question. What do we think? If the premises are jointly consistent, does that automatically tell us anything about whether the argument's valid or invalid?
No.
There's a bunch of them. Yeah, get your hand up, so yeah. Tell me more.
It's not valid, not necessarily valid, because it's possible for the conclusion to not follow out of the premises.
At least everything, so just knowing that the premises are jointly consistent doesn't get us enough to guarantee that it's valid or invalid. We need to know something now about the conclusion, right? We need to know, hey, all right, we know we can make all the premises true. Well, is it possible to do that and make the conclusion false? So now we have to test that second half, right? Good, so we'll come back to that. Okay, so again, note, blue boxes, I might ask you these definitions. So okay, this is our first kind of pair, consistency, inconsistency. Okay? Now the next one, the next kind of group of definitions is going to be 3 of them together. And this has to do with individual sentences. And actually this is something we've also already talked a little bit about implicitly. So when we think about sentences, it seems like some of them must be true. That is, not only are they the case, but they have to be. Whereas other sentences might be true or they might be false. And some seem like they have to be false. Not just that they are, but that they must be. And I'll try and motivate this with some examples. Again, I'm not too worried about whether you agree with these particular examples. I just want you to get the conceptual distinctions here. So this is my old dog Jopke. I keep her in as a tribute. So Jopke's on the grass. Take that sentence. Well, that seems like it could be true, right? As in the picture. Right? Or it could be false. She could have been standing over on the path instead, right? So that looks like it might be true, or it might be false. Could be true, could be false, depending on how the world sort of shakes out. Contrast that with our middle sentence. Either Jopke's fully on the grass, or she's not fully on the grass. Now, if we think about the ways that the world could kind of shake out, it seems like no matter what happens, this sentence is going to turn out true. If she's on the grass, cool, then that first part is going to be the case. Right? And if she's not fully on the grass, either because she's on the path, or she's halfway on the path, or she doesn't exist, or any one of a billion other things, the second one's going to be true. So no matter what happens with the world, it looks like this sentence comes out true. Do we see the kind of intuitive thought there? So it looks like by the structure of this sentence, it must be true. Not just that it is, but that it has to be. And then we have our third one, right? Jopke's both fully on and not fully on the grass. Well, this sentence looks like not only is it false, but there's no way the world could shake out where this comes out true. A similar one would be like Mars has exactly 2 and exactly 37 moons. Just the structure of this alone seems to require that it's not just false, but it must be false. You get the idea? Again, we can quibble about the particular examples, but the important thing is to pull these apart. So, let's give some terminology here. We can say that a sentence is a necessary truth if and only if it's true and it has to be. That is, it's true and it's not possible for it to be false. On the flip side, we can say a sentence is a necessary falsehood if and only if it's false and it's not possible for it to be true. And then finally, we can say a sentence is contingent if it's possible for it to be true and it's possible for it to be false. So basically what you have, if you think about all the assertoric sentences, remember we made the assumption they're all true or false, and they all have to be one or the other. You've got some that are way up at the top that are not just true but have to be true. There's no possible situation where they're false. You have some way down at the bottom that are not just false, but there's no possible situation where they're not false. And then you have all this stuff in the middle that can toggle back and forth. That's the middle stuff is the contingencies. Now, armed with this terminology, we can ask a very fun question. So I told you already about one way to get validity on the cheap. Right? It was to have jointly inconsistent premises. What's going to be another way to get validity on the cheap?
It has to be with the conclusion.
Yeah, it's good. So something with the conclusion, right? Because the one way to get validity on the cheap was something funny about the premises. If we make them such that it's not possible for them all to be true together.
Have no premises.
Well, if we have no premises, then the argument could still be valid or invalid, depending on what happens with our conclusion. But let's think about it, right?
If it's impossible for the conclusion to be false,
Yeah, if the conclusion must be true. So what kind of sentence would the conclusion be? Yeah! Right? So, 2 ways to get validity on the cheap. If the premises are jointly inconsistent, valid. We don't give a shit about the conclusion. Right? Similarly, if the conclusion is a necessary truth, valid. We don't give a shit about the premises. Done. for the same reasons. Validity says, hey, is there a possible situation where premises are all true and conclusions false? And if you can't do one or the other of those, you know you've already got validity guaranteed. Yes?
You can see that.
Yes, no problem. I'll say it a bunch. So, right? So again, remember, validity says, right, there cannot be a situation where premises are all true and the conclusion's false. And if it turns out that there's no way to make all the premises true, guaranteed validity. Similarly, if it turns out there's no way to make the conclusion false, you have guaranteed validity. And you do not need to care about the other sides. Because the important thing is to show that the argument is not valid, you've got to do both. And if you can't do one, you can't do both. Yes?
What's the difference between necessarily falsehood and jointly inconsistent?
Good. Very good question. So one thing to note is that necessary falsehood is a property of a single sentence. And joint inconsistency is potentially a property of several sentences, right? So if we look at 1 and 2, neither of those is a necessary falsehood, but taken together, they're inconsistent. But that hints at something, right? If we have a sentence, like say this one, that is a necessary falsehood, what do we know about it? Is it jointly consistent with anything? So if we have a necessary falsehood, to go back a definition, right? This sentence must be false. Is it consistent with anything? Can't be, right? Because no matter what you do, it's always going to let you down. We all have some friends like that. So all necessary falsehoods are always going to be jointly inconsistent with anything, any other sentences. There's a sense in which they're even jointly inconsistent with themselves, because they are always false. So it is not possible for them to be true with anybody else either. Nice. Good. So how are we feeling? Yes?
And what degree is time relative?
Good. That's a good question. So in some sense, we're kind of just basically assuming timelessness, right?
Okay.
And a lot of that is for simplification purposes, right? With regards to, again, kind of examples and independent cases, that makes things hard. For what I really am worried about is just let's get the conceptual differences. We can bicker about which goes where, but I don't really care about that. I just want to make sure we get the ideas. Good question. Yes?
Could the argument be valid if the conclusion is a necessary truth, but the premises are not, they don't have to do anything with their conclusion?
Yeah. In fact, it's guaranteed to be valid. In the same way that with the joint inconsistent premises. So you could have, Amanda's taller than Bart, Nathan's human, Yabka's either fully on the grass or not fully on the grass. Valid argument. Because it's impossible to make all the premises true and the conclusion false. It's the same kind of weird edge case, just hinging on, instead of something weird with the premises, it's something weird with the conclusion. Good. Yes?
Does that mean that the argument is also valid when there's a necessary falsehood, because the necessary falsehood there is a joint inconsistency?
Good. But only if the necessary falsehood is one of the premises. So here's something we'll talk a little bit about. Let it percolate. See if you can think of an example of a valid argument whose conclusion is a necessary falsehood. Just think about it. We're not going to talk about it right now. We'll talk about it in the tutorial, I think, on Tuesday. But let it percolate a little bit. Right. Okay. So that's a lot of stuff. I'm chucking these all at you. Again, don't stress if it's taking a lot to get in. We're going to work more on this with tutorials and things like this. These are the kind of key conceptions that I want to get out. Right? For the last 20 minutes or so, I want to pivot and let's start in on learning the very basics of our first formal language, this TFL stuff. Okay? It's going to be real easy. We just want to kind of get the general idea of what we're doing with TFL. Right? So, to start off, we're going to talk about my old dog Yabka for a minute. Right? So here's an argument. Yabka is asleep. If Yabka is asleep, then she's snoring. Therefore, Yabka is snoring. What do we think? Valid? Invalid? It's valid, yeah? It's valid, right? If 1 and 2 are true, then the conclusion must be true. 2 says, hey, if she's asleep, then she's snoring. 1 tells us that she's asleep, so she must be snoring. Note again, it doesn't matter if 1 and 2 are in fact false. The test is always, is it possible for 1 and 2 to be true and 3 false? And there's no way to do that. If 1 and 2 are true, 3 is guaranteed. Yeah? And here's another argument. Yabka is awake. Oh God, she's awake. If Yabka is awake, then she is hungry. Conclusion, Yabka is hungry. Valid? Invalid? Valid. Nice. Again, if 1 and 2 are true, 3 must be true. Do we notice anything interesting about this argument and the previous one?
Can you leave out 1?
Not quite. So we need 1 because 1 tells us the first part of 2 is true. Right? So 1's helpful to get us to the second part. Good. Good. Right. Do we notice anything else about these 2 arguments? Yeah. Yeah, so there's an if here, right? Both of them have this sort of if-then for 2.
You could switch out the first patterns, like the hungry and the awake.
Ooh, we'll talk about that. We got to get a little bit closer with that, right? Yeah.
It's both inductive, right? Because you make a generalization of time. So you say like, oh, if she's awake, then she's this.
Well, so we could always just add at this time to every single sentence, right? Yeah.
They have the exact same structure.
They have the exact same structure, right?
They state A, and then if A, then B, and that's B.
Yeah, do we see it? Nya, if nya, then nya. So nya. And the same thing. Or, to give it a different way, right? Blah blah, if blah blah, then blue blue. Therefore, blue blue. Right? I know it doesn't matter what we plug in for the blah blah and the blue blue, as long as we're consistent. Or to put this another way, we can replace the blah blahs and the blue blues, even though they're fun to say, with capital letters, right? A, if A then B, conclusion is B. And as long as we're consistent, that is, we replace the capital letters with the same sentence every time, it doesn't matter what sentence we fill in. Yabka's asleep, Yabka's snoring, Yabka's awake, Yabka wants to eat, Nathan's fat, Nathan's asleep. Hey, that's mean. Right? It doesn't matter what sentences you plug in for A or what sentences you plug in for B. If you're consistent, you get a valid argument. So this tells us something really cool. Sometimes you don't even care what the sentences are. You can tell an argument's good simply because of the structure it has. As long as it's an esoteric sentence, we don't care what it says. We know that it's a good form. If you get this idea, you've already got the very basic idea of TFL. This is what it does. TFL is going to replace atomic or basic English sentences, or Dutch sentences, French sentences, whatever you want, with capital letters. And then we're going to see, if we do this kind of capital letter replacement, do we get good structures? And if we do, we know the argument is valid. If we do that, we know it's valid. And it's going to be valid simply in virtue of its argumentative form. So we get an argument structure. If we can show that a given argument has the structure, we know it's valid. We don't care what the sentences are. So one way forward, if we're interested in validity, is to start to see if we can re-express everyday arguments, ones made in English, Dutch, French, German, etc., in this kind of good structure way. TFL is designed to do that. Strip the noise out, tell us the argumentative structure, and then figure out if it's a good or a bad one. In fact, there are plenty of good argumentative structures. Here's 3. We're not going to spend too long on them, but it's worth kind of seeing them. The first one here is right, either A or B. Right? We know not A, so it must be B. Right? I know he went either to the left or the right. He couldn't have gone down the left path because there's a dumpster blocking it, so he must have gone to the right. Similar one. We know it's not the case that both of these are true. We know that A is true, so B must be the one that let us down. And our last one, and this is very similar to the argument structure we saw a second ago, but it's subtly different. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. So, we can get this with an example. If Nathan had lunch, then he's not hungry. Nathan is in fact hungry, so what must not have happened? He ain't eaten yet, right? Because if he would have eaten, he wouldn't be hungry anymore. If the match lit, then there must be oxygen present. We know there's no oxygen present, so what couldn't have happened? The match couldn't have lit. So again, it's a subtle difference than the argumentative structure before, because remember the argumentative structure before we had was if A, then B, A, and the conclusion was B. Again, we're going to talk more about these, so don't stress about remembering them. They're kind of useful just to kind of get, but I'm not going to test you on these in particular. But these kind of things tell us, hey, if we come across certain argumentative structures, you're good. You don't care about what the A's and B's actually are. We know it's a good argument, at least with regards to validity. They are valid in virtue of their form, you might say. Now, it's notable that being valid in virtue of form is, of course, not the only way to be valid. Here's a valid argument. Premise 1, the Pope is a bachelor. Conclusion, therefore the Pope is male. This is a valid argument, but it is not valid in virtue of its structure, of its form. Instead, it's valid in virtue of the meaning of the word bachelor. Does everyone know bachelor? You come across that English word before? So a bachelor is an unmarried male, right? So if the Pope is a bachelor, we know some things about him. He ain't married and he's male. So contained within the meaning of that first sentence is the conclusion. So if one is true, the conclusion has to be as well. But no, it's not because of the structure. Because if we replace this, if we did this sort of capital letter replacement, this has a structure A, conclusion B. And with that structure, it's real easy to come up with cases where it's not valid. Yopka is snoring, Nathan is hungry. No. That's not valid.
Sorry, and if you add, in between 1 and 2, all bachelors are male.
Then we could have something that'll give us valid in virtue of form, right? But note what we have to do there is have more sentences. That ain't there yet. So we're going to set arguments that are valid in virtue of meaning aside. We're going to eventually work ourselves up to FOL, which gives us a way to kind of grasp these. But with TFL, we're never going to get it. It's always doing, to go back a slide, it's always doing this sort of stuff. Right? Always looking at these very basic structures where we don't know or really care that much about what the A's and B's mean, what they represent. Okay. And again, this highlights an important limitation of TFL. It's only really going to track these arguments valid in virtue of their form. It's the sledgehammer, right? Which is great sometimes, but sometimes you want to track this stuff too. But this is where we start. We start with TFL. We start with the sledgehammer because that's more fun. So our first formal language, truth functional logic, often called propositional or sentential logic. The way it works is we take natural language sentences. So in the context of this class, it'll be English sentences. And then we re-express them in the highly restricted language of TFL. And I should say it's re-expressing here rather than translating, because translation is concerned arguably with capturing or retaining meaning, and TFL don't play with meanings. They don't give a shit about that. It cares about structure. So the fundamental building block of TFL are atomic sentences. Atomic sentences are expressed by capital letters. They're the basic building blocks out of which all other more complex TFL sentences are going to be built. Right? Basically, think of any capital letter that is a way to express an atomic sentence in TFL. They are the one-by-one Lego from which we will build everything else. They can stand alone, so you can just have a capital letter by itself, like we saw with some of the premises a few minutes ago, right? Where we just had like A. Or they might be part of more complex sentences. If A, then B. So when we symbolize English into TFL, we replace all atomic English sentences with uppercase letters. These letters symbolize the relevant English sentences. They're not translations, because again, we're not capturing the meaning. And it's fairly straightforward, right? So we might symbolize Nathan is hungry as capital H, Lincoln was shot as capital S, either Yalka is awake or she's snoring. Well, we take Yalka is awake as A, and Yalka is snoring as N. You see how this goes. Now, as well as doing capital letters, we could, if we want to, also have subscripts, numerical subscripts. This is really only necessary if we end up with sentences where we have more than 26 individual atomic English sentences. I will never ask you anything like that. Right? But it's useful to have the tools to allow our machinery to capture anything. So we might do it this way, or you can just have capital letters. Capital letters with subscripts or without, depending. This is actually the very basics of the language. So cool, you've basically already got 2/3 of this thing already. You're almost fluent speakers, yes.
How did you call the different premises and conclusions that you express in the one, two, three?
So it's still always going to be premises and conclusions.
Oh, okay, so there's no words in general.
No. Okay?
So you can put the letter you want?
Yeah. So there'll be two kinds of scenarios, basically. One of them is one where I'll give you a mapping, right? Or there'll be ones where I ask you to give me a mapping. Or to use the terminology, we can say a symbolization key specifies which atomic sentence in English each capital letter represents. So here's a sample symbolization key. A stands for Yalka is awake. B stands for Yalka is snoring. And C stands for Nathan is hungry. Again, these kinds of symbolization keys basically just tell you how to read, if you have an English argument, how to read the representation of it in TFL, or vice versa, to go from TFL back to, say, an English or Dutch argument. Tells you the mapping. But of course, if we're thinking just purely in terms of TFL, this is not part of it. This is helping us understand what the TFL argument's relating back to. Cool? Okay. So, a sample symbolization key, and some sample English sentences. Let's do our very first exercise in symbolizing into TFL using this symbolization key. How would we symbolize our top English sentence? Using this key. Yeah, it's not a trick question, I promise, right? Capital A, bingo bango, right? How about our second one? If Lincoln was shot, then he died. See? Cool. How about Yovku's awake or she's snoring? DRE, right? And Nathan's hungry and Yovku's snoring. A&E. Nice. Cool. See? Look at this. It's amazing. We spent 20 minutes on it and you guys are already very fluent in this language. How proud of yourself should you be? Honestly, this is it. This is the basic thought behind TFL. We're going to take natural language arguments, map them to letters, express them, and then the next step is going to be looking at that structure, seeing if it's a good or bad structure. That's slightly tricky, but this is the first step. And the key to this first step is to just make a symbolization key. Line up the representations, the capital letters, with the relevant natural language sentences. That's the first step. The rest of it's all just smoke and mirrors. Okay, cool. So, the big advantage of symbolizing English in this way is that it's much easier to assess the form of these arguments. The A's and the B's spell it out. Because put really bluntly, English is messy. It allows for ambiguity. It includes things like implicature. It has stuff like tone. TFL doesn't have any of that. But the big disadvantage is that TFL is incredibly simplistic. In particular, whatever substructure there might be in an English sentence goes away when we do the expression into TFL. To put it another way, from the point of TFL, the point of view of TFL, atomic sentences are atomic in the Democritan sense. That is, they are structurally simple. There's no way to break them down. They have no parts. They're little black boxes. They're the 1x1 Lego cube. There ain't no smaller bits of Lego in there. This is the unit. And what this means is that there's no constituent parts. That is, TFL atomic sentences don't have words. English sentences do. This, to go back quite a few slides now, is why we can't capture this argument. Because if we express this in TFL, it is going to be A, therefore B. We're not guaranteeing that we can talk about the Pope. We need subsentential notions. But TFL only deals with sentences. Our atoms are indivisible. Okay. Again, I hit you with a lot of stuff. What we're going to do, we'll have a tutorial, I believe, Tuesday afternoon, I think it is. I should also say apologies for the slightly shifted schedule this week. It's my fault. I was away in Copenhagen at a conference. So we'll have the tutorial. Yes. No, it's fine. As always with this stuff, like attendance is encouraged. It is not mandatory. I would really, though, suggest if you're gonna skip one thing or the other, just between friends, skip the lectures, come to the tutorials. That's where we do most of the real work. Yeah. So what we're gonna do next week, we're going to go actually just the rest of the TFL. Right? Literally, after next lecture, you are going to be completely fluent in TFL. So how do we do this? We'll talk through this stuff in the tutorial. Hold on.